to TC Apologetics. Tonight, the topic will be postmodernism first, and then Scott will be talking about questions of entertainment again. I think we're going to be revisiting that a lot from what I've heard Scott talk about, because entertainment's forming our culture so much. I'm also going to talk about entertainment in this discussion of postmodernism, because a lot of what you're seeing in entertainment today is a reflection of this particular view. Let me start by saying that postmodernism as a influential theory in colleges and in philosophers is on its way out, if not out already. I read a book a couple weeks ago called A Brief History of Thought by a French philosopher named Luc Ferry, and this has sold, I don't know how many copies around the world and translated into dozens of languages. And one of his big contentions in the book is that not only has postmodernism failed, it failed badly, and they're looking for a replacement for it. The thing is, pop culture trails the intellectual circles by decades, 10, 20, 30, 40 years maybe. So even though in intellectual circles it's moving out, it's embedded itself in pop culture pretty strongly by now. And so you have a little bit of a disparity going on right now. The new trends are heading somewhere else, but the current trends that are affecting a lot of things are pretty solidly entrenched in postmodernism. Not everybody's postmodern. We'll get to some distinctions here in a minute. But it is something that is probably more formative, especially for youth today, than many other things. You see the quote on the screen: Nietzsche, the patron saint of postmodernity, prophesied accurately, if God is dead, then its interpretation all the way down. All he meant by that was, with no grounding of an objective truth, everything's open to people's interpretation. No interpretation can be regarded as final. As an interpretation, so in life, everything becomes undecidable. So I want to go through, on the first page that you have with your handout, some characteristics of postmodernism, where we see postmodernism and culture intersecting. In some ways it's forming culture, in other ways the culture that we have is just a fertile ground for postmodernism to flourish. I'll give you some practical examples of how we see it. But then in the second part, I want to talk about some solutions. What can we as Christians, are there things we can embrace about postmodernism? Must everything be rejected? Are there touch points where we can connect with people? And then ultimately, as Christians in a postmodern world, what are some key things we can do to connect with people who embrace this particular reality? Point number one, objective truth cannot be known is a key claim of postmodernism. It might exist. Postmodernism does not claim that there is no objective truth. Some might, but not the original founders of the movement. They just believe you can't find it because your opinion is so distorted by the things that have formed you. So everything's perspectival. Even if there's something out there to be found, capital T, truth, your community, your family, your religious or non-religious upbringing, it's going to so distort your ability to see it that it might as well, for all practical purposes, not be there. Practical implication of this: Comedy Central gives news to more 20-somethings than perhaps any other channel. Stephen Colbert and who's the other guy? I can't think of his name. Jon Stewart. They're the primary source of news, oddly enough, for a lot of people. But they don't claim to be giving objective presentations of the news. They're very much giving a perspective on it. And they don't try to trick you. That's just the way it is. And it's hilarious if you see the show. It's very entertaining. But there's not an attempt to establish some type of objectivity to it. Number two, there are no meta-narratives. I'm getting used to a new slide presentation here, so hopefully I'll keep up with this. A meta-narrative is simply a word that means a big story. It is a truth about reality that applies to everybody, all people, all places, all times. Postmodernism says those do not exist. It's all competing stories. I have a story, Ted has a story, Aubrey has a story. We all have little narratives, mini narratives, I suppose. And they're all equally valid because, once again, it's all perspectival. In this kind of perspective, then, experience is what matters the most. Not necessarily recounting the truth, but simply a sharing of experiences. It's, frankly, where you get movies like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. No one's making a claim that legitimately reality and history, Abraham Lincoln was hunting vampires. But what a cool experience that would have been had Lincoln secretly been fighting vampires. That's an exaggeration, but that's the idea. History, in postmodernism, history is a real tricky subject because you have to believe that every historian is writing an account of history that is perspectival, not somehow objectively true. Third point, identity is fluid. Who I am today will not necessarily be who I am tomorrow. You can recreate yourself as you need to. Madonna, Britney Spears may be the poster children for this. Madonna went through all these phases in her musical career where she presented herself in very different ways, from the materialist girl to the Kabbalah girl. Britney Spears, she's kind of stayed more the same in what she's shooting for. She's just had some bad episodes in her life. You can probably see that happening now with Miley Cyrus, who goes from being a very innocent teeny bopper. Was she a Mouseketeer too? Or was that just Britney? Britney was a Mouseketeer. What was the show that she was on? Hannah Montana, thank you. From Hannah Montana to, if you've seen her recently in award ceremonies, not Hannah Montana. She's recreating herself. But in a postmodern world, this idea of a fluid identity is very popular. I can be one person here, then another person here, then another person here. This might be from people group to people group. I'm a person at school, at work, at home, at church. It might be, though, that there's episodes of my life where I'm this kind of person for a while, then I'll simply become another kind of person. And eventually I can become another type of person. The idea is that they aren't necessarily connected. To some degree, they ought to all be kept separate. Like we all have a right to create our own episodic lives. Our identity remains fluid. Fourth point, reality is fragmented. Life is broken down into little stories. Just like your story is the mini-narrative instead of the meta-narrative, the episodes in your life are the same way. Think of it as a TV sitcom. You watch Everybody Loves Raymond. You've got an episode where something starts, something finishes, it's usually wrapped up pretty nicely. There might be an underlying story that keeps the show coherent, but you've got 30-minute episodes. Friends is the classic of this as well. You don't actually see a lot of spillover, at least in sitcoms. You do more in dramas. But the sitcom, you've got to present something and you've got to wrap it up in 30 minutes. And then the next week you start over in some ways. Seinfeld was probably the one that made the radar first. It was a show about nothing. And it was just episodes in their lives. And what was ultimately very pointless lives. The idea of postmodernism is that our lives can be lived that way as well. We have episodes, we have fragmented existences that ought not overlap. Practical example, I see kids at school, they have a Facebook life. And then they come to school and find out that their Facebook life has a real world impact at school, like you can't post that about your teacher. And they seem genuinely baffled, like, but I posted that on Facebook. I mean, I've had more than one conversation where I had to confront a student and it had not sunk in that that fragment of their life would somehow intersect with this fragment of their life. Or to try to talk to them about, if you're going to get a job or you want to have a particular career, you ought to be doing these things now to reach that point. I'm just doing this now. When it's time to do that, I'll do that. And none of this will matter. I'm like, no. It does matter, but it's the fragmentation of lives. Episodic lives is a way to think of it. Fourth point, deconstruction is crucial. Deconstruction, at least in the area of language and writing, is when you don't look for an author's intent or a speaker's intent for something. You try to deconstruct. Instead of constructing all the words to make a coherent message, you deconstruct all the words and try to find all the hidden prejudices that are in the text. So you don't necessarily need to read a whole book or a chapter or the entire news story or the entire quote from someone. If you can find a sentence or a fragment of a sentence that you think reveals a particular way they were formed so you can spot their prejudice, that's sufficient. The author's intent is not what's important in deconstruction. It's what you can do to discern how your interpretation shows a prejudice that's in place there. The classic quote from a former president, depends what the meaning of is. Okay, that's taking an entire sentence and choosing one word. You've deconstructed the word from the sentence. And you're letting it say what you want it to. two presidential candidates, or two presidential elections ago, I was watching on a news show where someone came on and accused another person of writing a particular thing about their war experiences. And they said, listen, in your book, you wrote this. You wrote, I was by the border of Cambodia or somewhere. Then over here you said, I was in Cambodia, so you lied. And this person stopped them and said, would you read the whole paragraph? And the person challenged them and refused to do it. And the guy who wrote the book said, I know why you're not doing it, because if you read the whole paragraph, I clearly contextualize what I mean by on the border in Cambodia. It's obvious. And the guy who challenged him refused to acknowledge the paragraph. He said, no, you said this in this sentence. That's deconstruction. Last big point, meta-narratives or power plays. This idea of, because language, you're deconstructing language to find the prejudices, and there are no big stories, so if someone's trying to tell you this truth with a big T, not only are they claiming to know something they can't know in postmodernism, but they're trying to make you believe it and make you follow it. That's oppression, because not only do they believe something false or so distorted by their own prejudices, they're forcing you to enter into their prejudice. So language is a power play. Anytime someone comes across forcefully or dogmatically, lots of different adjectives you could use there, you resist that, because claims to knowledge are claims to power, not claims to actual truth. You may have, well, if you look at your handout, you've got a cartoon. A guy's talking. The guy on the ground says, ouch, you're standing on my neck. And the big guy says, that's one point of view. One could also say, you're trying to trip me with your neck. You see, in the postmodern condition, we create our own reality based upon our internalized preconceptions. Since there is no longer one objective truth, we're free to create our own truth. So you see, there's no right and wrong, just an infinite number of equally valid stories. And the guy on the ground says, but you're still standing on my neck. And the big guy says, you never went to college, did you? That's not a bad summary of the idea of what's going on in postmodernism. I happen to kind of like this one too. Postmodernism, you may have 2 degrees, but I read an article once in Wikipedia. Because the source of your truth doesn't matter. Because all truth is a perspective. There is no objective truth that someone's handing to somebody else. So any news source is as good as the other. We're going to get to this in the next section. The internet has provided great fuel for postmodernism, because you've got so many competing voices trying to tell you things with no easy way to discern who to trust. And so there's your easy fallback. Let's look here. Postmodern culture. A couple key things. Number one, a distrust of authoritative statements. There's been a real shift from truth to perspective or image. If you hear somebody speaking or you see somebody speaking, the important thing is not whether you agree with them, but if you like them. Because in postmodernism, there is no guarantee they're telling you truth. In fact, they're probably not. So what do you do if everybody around you is bringing some type of perspective that you shouldn't fully embrace? Well, you find the person you like, or the person you think would be cool to connect with. So you increasingly see a media culture. I mean, politics is increasingly becoming this way. Politicians present themselves in a way that you like them, irrespective of their message. The message is not important. It's if you click. There's a cynicism about truth. There's an overload of information. Internet is fueling this like crazy. If you Google any topic, you'll get 1 million hits. Now, how do you decide who to listen to? That's pretty tough. I mean, even if you go with major news sources, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, okay, all of them, the claim will be they're all perspectival, and if you watch them, they do have very different perspectives on news stories or how to understand news stories. So what do you do with that? Well, you either have to follow one person and block out everybody else, which some people do, or you get this kind of jaded cynicism which says, I really can't trust everybody. I'll just have to read all of them and assume they're all partially wrong and find my own way in the midst of all this information. Third, there's a focus on choice. If there is no objective truth that can be accurately conveyed to other people, and if I can't actually know objective truth, even if it exists, because I've been formed in particular ways, then the ultimate thing is I have to be able to choose. If I can't choose and someone else is forcing me to do, someone else is oppressing me, someone else is oppressing me just by claiming something's true or that I ought to live a particular way. So to be a genuine person, I almost can't do what other people say. I have to choose for myself what to think and what to do. There's an increasing breakdown of social constraints. Propriety. What is proper social etiquette? Well, that's a meta-narrative. That's a culture oppressing you with an idea of what it means to be a healthy, a good citizen. Put in the adjective there that you would like. So you have people who are increasingly countercultural. I'm not sure it's entirely because they just want to be jerks, but I think it's because they don't want to be impressed by other people. If you really believe that what other people are telling you to do does not have a foundation that is necessarily trustworthy, the one way in which you fight against the oppression of misinformation is you be your genuine self and you push back. And you can do it with appearance, you can do it with language, you can do it with the things you choose to do, the careers you choose. But in an attempt to be genuine, you almost have to reject what other people tell you is a smart or a good or a healthy thing to do. Well, okay, I'm going to have to find this out for myself. I'm going to have to choose. That means I'm going to have to push boundaries in every way that I can. I already mentioned the fragmentation of the self, the episodic life. I do think TV fuels this. I talk to more and more youth who I genuinely think view their lives like a TV show. I have an episode here, I have an episode here, I have an episode here. And trying to connect them is increasingly difficult. There's a breakdown of shared cultural experiences. This is not all these things are postmodernism's fault, by the way. This is simply a cultural venue that is giving fuel to this. What I mean is, if you ask a room full of teenagers today, and I do it every year at school, what's your favorite band? Most times I will get a different answer from every kid in the room. And about a third of the bands no one will have ever heard of, except for the person who likes them. It gets worse if you say, what's your favorite song? Almost nobody shares a favorite song. And probably half or more of the songs that are chosen nobody knows, other than the person who chose them. What about your favorite TV show? I almost get entirely unique answers in every class that I ask this to. And once again, in fact, it's worse than with the music. Fewer kids know what other people are watching. Music, because of the technology we have to ego-cast to ourselves, kids aren't getting broad cultural experiences like they used to. So when you try to get them together, like in class, I'll be talking about something like this, and I'm like, hey, have you guys seen this movie? One hand. Now, okay, let's take Lord of the Rings. I figured that was such a cultural phenomenon. Everybody's seen it. It's just not the case. How many of you have seen Lord of the Rings? Any of the movies? Okay, that's 90% of you. My classroom at school is 10%. Even a movie like The Avengers, 20%. It makes it increasingly difficult to talk about shared experiences because they don't have them anymore. School's a shared experience. Church to some degree, though church attendance is a lot more sporadic, and youth are very fluid with church attendance. But these other things, like when I was younger, when we finally got a TV when I was 18, I might watch, wow, what should I reveal about myself here? The A-Team. And I could have a conversation with most people my age the next day about the A-Team. There wasn't much else on, unfortunately. Greatest American Hero, that's a bad example. 60 Minutes as a news show. That was Monday morning water cooler talk because it was a shared experience. If you watch the news on Sunday, you watch 60 Minutes. Now, if you go Monday morning and say, hey, did you see the news story on Channel X or on this website or you name it, you might not have anybody else who has seen that story. So in a postmodern world where already you've got this idea of fragmented lives, and nobody else can tell me what to do. It's not their fault, they just don't know. I'm going to have to find my own way, I'm going to have to do my own thing, I'll be genuine within myself. Now you've also lost this connection with other people. Just took a trip this last weekend to Chicago with a bunch of youth from our church. It is interesting to hear their conversations. They can't talk about bands they like. They might sing 1 or 2 songs together, but in a van with 6 kids, 3 of the kids will sing it. The other 3 don't know what they're singing. And then that just gets annoying for everybody. So, the other 3 start competing. We'll sing this song, and then it gets real inappropriate real fast. So breakdown of shared cultural experiences. A desire of breadth rather than depth. What I mean by that is desire for a vast number of experiences instead of a smaller number of experiences that are really deep. Because in this competing world of ideas and fragmented truth, you've got to experience everything you can so you can absorb everything you can so you can make a genuinely good choice. That means you don't have time to spend with a particular thing for long. So whether it's news, books, music, radio, TV, friends, family, any kind of experience, you're increasingly seeing this almost desperation to experience everything I can. And we'll come to how that actually can be healthy in some ways, but what's being given up is the ability to really dig deeply into something. Relationships, for one. If you have a friend who makes you angry, why bother to dig in and really get a genuine friend? You can find another friend. In fact, maybe you should, because that builds your experiences. If you're dating someone and it's starting to get tough, why not just find someone new to date? I don't have time to work on this. There's so many things in life to experience. I need to go find my own way. And last of all, flux versus stasis. This is the idea of the journey and the destination. Through, I would say, most of human history, families or cultures or communities had a lot of discussion about future goals. What are you going to be? What are you going to do? What kind of person would you like to become? What are your hopes and dreams and things like this? And I think of it as putting a puzzle together. When I put puzzles together, I have the box beside me and I see the big picture so that the little puzzle pieces, I know where they go. I can find where they match on the overall scheme of things, and so I know how to put them together well. I think it's all being flipped. Postmodern generations, they don't want the box top. They don't think that far ahead. Not because they're trying to be irresponsible, but because a message that's been absorbed is the journey is the important thing. If I journey well, I'll reach a good destination, even if I don't know what it is. I don't need to have a destination in sight. I'll put each individual puzzle piece down. If the puzzle piece works well, the eventual picture it creates will be beautiful. So this shift from destination to journey. There's something to be said for embracing both those things, but it is a huge shift. I don't know about you guys, but when I was in high school, a lot of time was spent saying, what are you going to do when you graduate? How do you order your life now to reach this particular goal? What are your plans? And we would probably have things in mind, and if someone gave us advice in general, not everybody, we would say, okay, I should start ordering my life this particular way. Increasingly, I do not see that with the youth I work with. They're very concerned about living in the moment well. They want to do something well, but they don't know where it's going to take them, and they're fine with that. And I've talked with a lot of frustrated parents who are like, my kid has no hopes, dreams, or goals. Well, that's not necessarily true. I think they do, but they don't want to commit to, I'm using this term loosely, I don't have a better term for it. They don't want to commit to a meta-narrative yet. They want the experiences. They want to absorb and learn a lot of things on their own, and eventually they'll reach a point where they grasp onto something, hopefully. So I don't think it's an attempt to be lazy or to check out of life, but it's a fragmentation that we see in terms of long-term planning. You see on your handout a number of movies. I don't think I'm going to go through them just for time's sake. You can ask me about this later. In fact, if we do some Q&A at the end, if you're curious about some of those. But I suspect in that list, most of us haven't seen most of them. That would be interesting to pull to take at the end. So we can come back and revisit that later. Here's the thing with media. I already mentioned the fragmentation of knowledge. Even this idea when you watch a news show, that you can go from a story about starving children in another country or genocide of Rwanda, and then next go to a story about how a local kitten was saved out of a tree. And then you go to a commercial for some type of dish detergent. Then you'll go back to something, the presidential election, which will be followed by a story about Brad and Angelina. And so you just get these incredibly diverse things just put right next to each other. Now, there's a hidden message that comes through the medium. Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message. It's the great equalizer. In other words, here I have a minute on Rwanda, and here I have a minute on Brad and Angelina. Which one's more important? Well, they each got a minute. What do I do with that? And then I go to, you might have commercials for incredibly diverse things as well, but they each get 30 seconds, they pay the same amount of money, and they're hitting a niche audience. Okay, it's an equalization of experiences in some ways. Why should I care more about one than the other based on the way it's presented? You probably shouldn't, or at least it makes it difficult to discern how you should. I already mentioned the episodic nature of TV sitcoms. The cynicalness, if that's a word, that you see coming out of people. I noted here reality shows versus reality. One of the things that's been intriguing to watch with the rise of reality shows is the way in which it is portrayed as being real. Like we took a camera to a place and we videoed someone, and this is how people are. But it's not how people are. It's how people are when there's a camera on them. And there's plenty of stories floating around out there about how documentary crews can change a room. I heard an interview with the guy who filmed the Girls Gone Wild videos. And he talked about how they changed a bar when they walked into a bar. So they would walk in and no one would know who they were. And they would just watch. Then they would start setting up cameras and their signs, and by the time they were ready, the bar was already reflecting the kind of footage that the people at the bar had seen in their previous Girls Gone Wild videos. So he said, we never walked into a bar where that was actually what was going on. But once they knew we were there and the cameras were on, they acted like they knew we wanted them to act. Well, reality shows are huge. Now you take Jersey Shore, now you take all these different shows that are showing real life of teenagers or 20-somethings all around the world. And you've got this difficulty with, especially a young generation, of trying to make the distinction between what's reality and what's a reality show. And what happens is you get this reality show vibe, kids try to reflect it in real life, and it ends badly. It's not so glossy as the TV show showed it to be. So now you're increasingly becoming jaded and hardened because I saw this presentation. It was an experiential thing. It wasn't a truth thing. It was an experiential thing I saw on TV. I embraced it as, hey, that looked like a great experience to experience. And they tried it, didn't work. So now you're stuck. You can't rely on news. You can't rely on factual things. And I can't rely on how other people's experiences are presented to me as well. Boy, we could talk about the Project X movie, which is being replicated in real life by teens who went and saw the movie and said, awesome idea, and have tried to replicate it, and they were doing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage to things and being arrested and going to jail and all kinds of things because it turns out a party like that in real life is very different from a party like that on film. So now even experience is being jerked out from under you because they're buying into TV like real life. Last thing, a passive generation. Thinking of the lyrics to one of the songs from Nirvana, Here We Are Now, Entertain Us. And this song was written as kind of a mockery of the scene at the time, but it was an insightful song in some ways. I challenged my kids at school, try going to a party where there's no electronics. Would you have a good time? Or are you just consumers increasingly sitting back and saying, bring something to me. I would like to be stimulated intellectually. I would like to be entertained. I want something to happen that caters to me. And if nothing's happening, then we're bored. My kids are bored all the time. My 6-year-old especially. That's a different story. I want to give you a couple other examples. We're going to skip the media and the message. You see this showing up in architecture even. This is one of my favorite ones. At Ohio State University, go Buckeyes, the Ohio State University, There's the Wexner Center for the Arts. Les Wexner is a guy who lives in Columbus and who has basically built half the city by now, I think. But he funded a Center for the Arts, which they intended to be a postmodern building. And so they're trying to capture postmodernism through the structure itself. So you see here on the outside, you see what looks like kind of a tower, but it's split in half. It's fragmented. If you would go around the building, you would see these juxtapositions of brick, glass. I mean, really odd kind of things. There doesn't appear to be a theme to it like in classical architecture. They're purposefully breaking up the architectural design, whether through the form or the substances that make the form. In fact, if you see the flower beds outside, they are, instead of mulch, they have broken glass. So everything they're doing is very purposefully building into this idea. If you go inside, you'll see things like columns coming down from the ceiling that don't reach the floor. I don't know if you can see it here. That one there, there's more than one. The idea is that nothing supports reality. Nothing supports this building like nothing supports reality. You'll also see things like stairs that lead up into a wall and have no door at the top. Once again, the idea that journey is important. There might be no destination. But hey, it's really cool stairs. So the whole building is meant to capture architecturally what is happening in postmodernism. Ravi Zacharias talks about going there and talking with people about, okay, but they do have some columns that go from the ground up, or the building would collapse. I mean, they have some stairs that go through doors, or you never get to the second floor. And there's some things about it that are incoherent that we'll get to later, but you at least see attempts to try to capture the idea. Okay, some internal dilemmas. I'm on the second page now. How am I doing time-wise, Scott?
You're fine.
I want to talk about the things that undermine postmodernism within itself, and then I want to talk about some things that postmodernism has brought to the table that have been healthy in correcting some distortions in the general culture. For one of the claims of postmodernism is that objective truth can't be known. The problem is that's a meta-narrative. That's a truth claim that is meant to be true for everybody. So postmodernism does not say, hey, truth can't be known for some people. It says truth can't be known for anybody. Okay, you can't make that claim without stating a truth that's known for everybody. Second one, there are no meta-narratives, is one of the claims, but that's a meta-narrative, that's a big story. What they're saying is, for no person in the world, at any place or at any time, were they able to transcend their perspective and their bias and actually see truth clearly, or, okay, that's everybody. So you can't make a claim about a meta-narrative or a lack of a meta-narrative without using one to make the claim. The idea that identity is fluid. Here's the problem with, there's multiple problems. One of the key ones is nobody lives this way. So if I were to be arrested for a crime I committed 5 years ago, and I would go in front of the judge and my defense would be, but I'm not who I was then. No one would listen to me. I could even make a claim, listen, the cells and molecules in my body, whatever percentage it is, a huge percentage, are changing so often. I'm literally, physically not the same person that I was. How can you possibly hold me responsible for this? No court will listen to you. If I would go home to my wife and she'd say, oh, why were you out till 3 o'clock last night? I go, that was a different me. Well, the wife will not say it. And she'd say, now your room is a different room. If you go to get a job somewhere and you have to write down your past job history. My son applied for a job here in town recently, and as he was filling it out, the person in charge was kind of telling him some of the things he'd had written down before. He's like, well, they're not working here. And for some, it was years ago, things they'd done. You can't work here. You've got this on your record. Your life follows you. From a Christian perspective, you can be forgiven. Life goes on. But in a practical sense of things you're qualified to do or allowed to do, real life mitigates against the idea that identity is fluid. My son just got his license. If he gets a certain amount of points, he will lose his license. And if he does particular things, he could lose his license a long time, to the point where he could do enough things, he could not go to a judge somewhere and say, I'm not who I was. The judge says, I don't care who you were, violated traffic laws so much we will never trust you with a car again. So this idea that identity is fluid, no one lives that way in a presence. It's not a rubber meets the road kind of way to live. The other idea that goes with that is the notion that we're not actually talking then about people becoming better people or worse people. All we're doing is talking about people becoming different people. So let's say I'm a really bad guy, and I decide I'd like to be someone new, and I genuinely become a better person through a lot of hard work and effort. Postmodernism has difficulty saying I moved from bad to worse. It says I moved from here to here. I'm person X, I'm person Y. A couple months ago, I was at the Opera House to hear an interview with the creator of Breaking Bad. And the whole idea of the show is he wants to take a guy who's good and have him break bad, become a bad guy, and watch the process unfold. Okay, is he going from good to bad, or is he going from one thing to a different thing? He was a school teacher, a science school teacher with a family. Now he's a meth dealer. Is that simply a new identity, or are we allowed to go, yeah, that was a bad move? Postmodernism has difficulty saying that was a bad move. It also has difficulty saying that was a good move. Another character in the show seems to be trying to move away from that. I haven't seen the last year or two's worth. Okay, is he becoming a better guy or a different guy? The idea that reality is fragmented and episodic, kind of the same idea. Our lives are connected. We can't separate things that happen. When my wife and I were first married, we made some bad purchases using our credit card. I got to tell you, I'm not allowed to go to the credit card company and go, that was then, this is now. Yeah, they'll hang up on you. Last of all, deconstruction, I'm sorry, I got two more. Deconstruction is crucial in postmodernism. But postmodernists don't want to be deconstructed. When I was in college, I had to take a class on literary philosophy, and as you might imagine, it was really thrilling. But I had to read an entire essay by a postmodernist writer whose claim was that all language, because it is so distorted, you don't look for the author's intent. It's important that you take from it, you make it say what you want it to say, you read into it what you want to. And I had to write an essay in response to this, so I did, and I kind of just talked about a different topic. I didn't get a great grade on it. I thought it was clever. But my thought was, okay, the person writing this said, you're not supposed to pay attention what the author's trying to convey. You're supposed to make it say what you want. So I did. But that's not what the author wants me to do. The staunchest postmodernists in the world, if they're having a conversation with you, or they get hired for a job, and the employer says to them, what will you work for? And they say, I'll work for $20 an hour. And the employer says, great, $2 an hour is perfect. And this guy says, but I said 20, and the employer says, yes, but there's a 2 and a 0. I see that too. A 0 is nothing. So $2 an hour is what you claimed. But you go, no, it doesn't work that way. It's a 20. It's not a 2 and a 0, but it isn't. Okay, you get the idea. No one wants to be treated that way. It would make conversation impossible. It would make any type of agreement or relationship impossible as well. And the idea that meta-narratives are power plays, or that language is a power play, or a claim to truth is an oppression. You can't get around the fact that you're writing entire books, you're teaching entire college courses, you're doing seminars explaining why one person's opinion about truth is oppressive, and if they use words to make you agree, they're oppressing you. That you simply can't hold that with sincerity, intellectual honesty. Sincerity you can, intellectual honesty. Which is one reason why I believe postmodernism is fading. It's brought, and I'll get to this in the next part, it brought some healthy ideas to the table that corrected some past distortions, but ultimately the more people looked at it and really delved into it, they're like, okay, there's got to be something that brings some stability to what we say. I read an article a number of years ago when we first went into Iraq for the second time. Make sense? I was reading an article by a postmodern professor, I think it was in the New York Times, And he said, I've held to postmodernism for years. One of the things I've held is that we can't state too boldly things are right or wrong because it's perspectival. But here's the thing. I realized I believe the war is wrong. And I can't believe that and be postmodern. So I am abandoning my postmodernism because I have to be able to take a stand on some things. And now with the rise of terrorism and a lot of things that are happening around the world, if you want to be the kind of person who can say, I think some things are wrong, it's just not my perspective, it's the way things are, you can't be postmodernist, at least genuinely postmodernist. Okay, some benefits. And these will all just pop up on the screen, so I don't have to worry about clicking. For one, I think postmodernism brought to the table an important reminder that we ought to be careful about blindly accepting authority. There's a lot of people out there making claims that they ought to be the ones who are listened to, and it's very easy to simply find a compelling voice or a pretty face and say, hey, I'm with you. I'd like to be on your team because you're the cool guys. Postmodernism says you can't do that. You have to recognize that there's something about people that ought to bring a caution in you. And I think it was a healthy one. Coming out of modernism, where there were some pretty strict claims about things like, say, science has all the answers. Listen to scientists. Postmodernism said that's not necessarily true. Sure, listen to scientists, but you've got to keep in mind that they're not necessarily giving you 100% truth. Be smart as you filter what people have to say. A reminder that all of us look at life through worldviews that we bring to the table. I think it's absolutely true. We are formed by our communities and by things around us. Now, I don't think it follows that we are so distorted that we can't see truth. But it should be a humbling thing to recognize, okay, when I am learning about something or I'm talking about something, even a topic like this, I might not understand everything about postmodernism perfectly. Someone else might have something to say that will clarify something that's better than I did. I'm okay with that. But whether it's like in marriage thinking, what am I bringing to my relationship between my wife and I? Is it possible that I don't see myself clearly? Sure it is. Is it possible that books I've read and speakers I really like aren't 100% correct? Sure. And that's okay. It's not like truth can't be found through all these types of things. But it's a healthy way of reminding, especially ourselves, think through what we have to say. Is what we're bringing to the table something that's objective and outside of us, and not just something we've pulled in and absorbed because of things that have formed us in ways we didn't understand. Third, a refocusing on the power and the gift of language. And granted, postmodernism pulled the rug out under itself by deconstruction, but it did note something important. Language is powerful. Words matter. You can manipulate people through words. Propaganda is a bad thing. Postmodernists would tend to see everything as kind of propaganda. So they took it too far, but the idea that what you say has an impact on people in the world around you was a good reminder. A focus on community, because of the importance of shared experiences. Friendships and relationships are very, very important, especially if you don't have a grounding of truth, you have a grounding of people. So you try to find communities who will support you and will help you become a better person, if you can use the language of postmodernism. So community is very important. An appreciation of experience, not just kind of impersonal information, but it is important to know things and experience things about life. I've been to Costa Rica several times with a group from church. It's one thing to read about Costa Rica. It's another thing to go there and hang out with the people and see the place and get the vibe and know what it's like. It's a completely different thing. An openness to other views. Postmodernism, of course, opened so much it has trouble shutting on anything. But they opened the door again. One of the things it did was bring Christianity back to the table as a legitimate worldview and discussion. Probably 10 to 15 years ago, there were a lot of books being written by Christian college professors who said, before this, colleges were not a friendly place for Christians to weigh in and to bring their worldview to the marketplace of ideas. Now it is, because postmodernism can't exclude you, because all perspectives have a right to be at the table. So it did offer great opportunity for Christians to be able to step forward boldly and go, oh, I've got something to say about this particular issue too. Finally, desire for authenticity. The idea that I need to be a genuine person. I don't want to be a person who is simply formed by what other people tell me. I need to wrestle with who I am. Now, without a foundation, that can be troublesome. You can wrestle with it and become a really bad person. But there was a return to the idea of, I can't just blindly walk through life. I've got to be a person who is intellectually honest about what I'm hearing, is relationally honest, experientially honest, all these things. I've got to be a genuine and a real person. Like Pinocchio. Did anybody else in here want to go, I'm a real boy? Nobody? Can we add that? Okay, a couple things. 4 key things on a Christian response to postmodernism. Number 1, this idea of the fragmented lives and this unity of identity. We would claim that the soul connects the episodes of our lives. That even as our physical body replaces itself, even as our experiences change, there is a unity to our existence that is best understood through the presence of the soul, through the presence of the supernatural. It's tough in a strict materialistic view of the world to find a unity to your identity. But in a supernatural view of the world, there is something about us that transcends our physical body and connects who we are. In fact, we all participate in this meta-narrative, but it's of eternal significance. It's not just a big story that's just a story for now, but there's an overarching story of sin, of salvation, of God, of a fall, of redemption, of a life to come. The meta-narrative of Christianity is a huge story. And our lives are part of that. We're connected with it. The idea that we're created in the image of God, it frees us from being trapped in our perspectives, because one of the things I believe is that though I have had things that have formed me, my family, my community, my church, my schools, all these things have formed me, but that the act of God within me, one of the things He does is free me from being locked into perspectives that might be unhealthy. There's something He brings that transcends my experiences. My history is not my destiny in a Christian worldview. Many things can form me, but they're not the end of the story in my life. God brings something to the table that breaks cycles of bad perspectives that have helped to make me who I am. I think the way we as Christians best represent this culturally is to be people who don't live fragmented lives. Hypocrisy is another word for this. If people see us living fragmented lives, you go to church, but I saw you here. Yeah, I know you're a Christian, but I saw you do this. To try to explain that, if we try to separate it, that we're buying into it. We're not offering anything different. But a life of honesty, genuineness, and integrity wraps all the different things into our lives together. So there is a unity, there's a fluidity to who we are as followers of Christ, that someone can't look at us and say, you're this kind of person there, and then there, and then there, and then there. 4 different people. They see us the same everywhere we go. The idea is, how do you maintain that integrity? Because of this, and I talk about the presence of Christ in my life. The idea of language. The things that undermine postmodernism in terms of language, I think are great talking points. We agree language has the power to transform as well as destroy. It's important that we choose our words carefully so that what we're trying to say can't be misinterpreted. But we also genuinely believe the authorial intent is important. If I'm talking with Adam and Adam says something to me, if I'm a genuine friend, I'm trying to understand what Adam says. I'm not trying to read it between the lines and make Adam say something I want him to say. Life doesn't work that way at all. And that's how you experience life. As a Christian, I also believe that's the case with the Bible. The Bible is presented in such a way that my goal is to hear what it has to say, not deconstruct it and make it say what I want it to say. And just like I can understand Adam, even if language is flawed, which it is to some degree, we can understand each other. If I say, Adam, get me a cookie, Adam will get me a cookie. No. And even if the image that comes to Adam's mind of cookie is different than the image that comes to my mind, we're on the same page. Right? So even with the Bible, even if language is imperfect, I believe God has given something to us in such a way that we can understand it. It doesn't have to be perfect to understand what's being communicated. And in fact, I would add, Christians have to embody how language can be non-coercive and non-oppressive. There's way too much language used by Christians that's just bullying. Man, that plays right into the idea that language is a power play. I believe as Christians, we need to be people who know the art of speaking in such a way that we're convincing, that we're engaging, that we're attractive in what we have to say. People can disagree with us. The message we have to say as Christians is one that plenty of people disagree with. But we ought to be the kind of people that nobody can walk away and say, man, they were jerks. They were trying to play tricks with me with their words, and they were twisting what I had to say, and all these kind of things. We've got to be people of the Word who know how to use words well and use them whimsically in the kingdom of God. The idea of meta-narratives. God is a meta-narrative. Sin, salvation, heaven, hell. For God so loved the world is a meta-narrative claim. It's a big story. We can't get around that as Christians. The Bible makes big claims. The challenge for us is to show that the presence of a big story is compelling and not frightening. I think for many people, especially now that the news cycle is global and because of things, terrorism is a good example. They see that the terrorists have a big story for the world, and they're trying to put it onto the world through violence and force everyone to follow along. It makes people react. I don't want that kind of big story. But we as Christians are making a big story claim. So it's important that as we make that claim, we don't come across in a way that pushes these hot buttons like, hey, I knew somebody else who made a big story claim and then narrative claim, and they were mean, or they were violent, or they were all these other kinds of things. The claim we make needs to be one that is compelling, that's genuine, that is not one that is a claim of oppression. John 3:17, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, that the world through him might be saved. That's the meta-narrative we're saying. God wants to save you. God loves you. God's people love you. It's the big story that we tell over and over again. And as we do that, we get this idea of the journey and the destination. For Christians, heaven is a destination. The life to come with Christ is a destination. In fact, in this life, as Christ works in us, we have smaller destinations of, I can be this kind of person, I can be freed from this kind of sin, I can have this kind of freedom that Christ brings. But we're not the kind of people that look so far into the future that we forget the importance of now and overlook people or overlook small things because we're so future focused. At the same time, we're not so present focused that we forget about the hope to come. Blending these two things, the journey and the destination, showing people that a destination doesn't have to be frightening, it can be very compelling, and that helps us order our journey in such a way that we reach the place that we want to go. And with that, I think that's my whirlwind tour of postmodernism. Like I said before, it's not a perfect one. There's a lot of stuff out there that's written that can add a lot of clarity to what I had to say. But hopefully, if you weren't familiar with it, it's a starting point. And questions? What time? How much time do I have, Scott, for questions?
Yeah, we do 5-10 minutes, I guess.
Are there any questions? Maybe that's the first thing to ask.
I just have a comment on the reality shows. I happen to know personally that they're not reality. They are staged, most of them at least. We had one come, what was it, something Bridezilla. So it used to be a little series on TV apparently. They came to one of the shows that I do and completely staged the whole thing. They had scripts that they read from, they retook things. So it was no reality involved at all. It was just perceived as this is a reality show. And I suspect that most of them are that way.
There was a show that Paris Hilton and who was your friend?
Nicole
Richie did, where they went to the country and hung out with people, and it was good laughs to watch them try to milk a cow. Well, there was a subplot at one point where she apparently started liking a local guy. I think they maybe shared a secret kiss or two, and then they broke up, and it was heart-wrenching. Well, not too long after that, the story came up, completely scripted. The producers said, we need to get a little more activity on the show. Our ratings are bad. Why don't you start... Anyway, and the show folded because once it became well known that this was not some genuine expression of living in the country, people lost interest.
That's a smart aleck comment. I do have.
No.
Once in a while. I wondered if you wanted to say in your head any thoughts on whether this is strictly a secular issue, or if it exists that affects Christianity, if it's different in the two streams, if we ought to deal with these different conversations, or be on the lookout for anything, or you know what I'm getting at all?
Yeah. There's definitely a Christian version of postmodernism. It doesn't make exactly the same claims, but one of the two big things that strike me just off the top of my head is that the Christian postmodernist is too tentative to make bold claims about the meta-narrative of Scripture. So let's take the idea that, do other religions have truth to offer to the world that's genuine? I think they do to some degree. I think all truth is God's truth, and I think other religions contain fragments of the truth that God revealed to us. That's a very different claim from saying all roads lead to God. The Christian postmodernist tends to say, why don't we make the meta-narrative be even more meta? Christianity won't be the meta-narrative. Religion will be the meta-narrative. Christianity is one of the small stories under the umbrella of God. So they do end up making claims that people from all the religions are all going the same place. All these roads lead to the same place. So that's one of the dangers of Christian postmodernism, is trying to make the meta-narrative bigger than it should be, so that we don't offend people, usually. The other danger, I think, is the idea of deconstructing Scripture. This happens, unfortunately, quite a bit, where rather than trying to look at the message of Scripture in its entirety, you'll look at particular things to bolster a point of view. I think the main person who gets a lot of press about this is Brian McLaren. I read one of his most recent books in which he talked quite a bit about how to read the Bible, and he thoroughly deconstructed it. So yeah, those would be the two main things I would say: making the meta-narrative too big and breaking the Bible down too small.
A lot of the subpoints appear in the religious discussion too, like abandoning doctrine and instead making something out of one of Christ's stories that is fluffy.
You know, I think Christians might actually be guilty of deconstructing language more than we like to acknowledge. Well, how much Christian infighting has there been over the reading of one verse or of one paragraph out of the Bible without a discussion of what's the big picture of the Bible and how does it fit under that umbrella? I think that crosses denominations. It may be as old as the history of the church, but for all the time Christians have spent complaining about postmodern influence, I think if we're not careful, we're not entirely honest that we have a tendency to do that as well. There's something seductive about the idea of being able to read a particular text, especially a troublesome one. The Bible makes pretty hard commands on my life. If I can find a way to read that allows me to continue in the way I want to, that's compelling. I mean, to a certain degree. And so it is interesting to me that the Christian community has said postmodernism and then very quickly fragmented the Bible in every way that it can.
I wonder, do you have any comments about the lag behind college campuses dropping the idea and modern thought not dropping it? How does it finally happen? Is it just we kind of tuck it under the rug, pretend we never believed that, and move on 10 years later to the other new idea?
Let's take Marxism or communism. There was a time it was fashionable. Let's say the 50s, 60s, maybe even into the 70s. There was at least a window where the Soviet Union was seen by many as kind of the utopia that Marx hoped it would be. And of course, that was before the internet and the instant news cycle, and before we've had instant access to see what other countries are like. But yeah, there was a lot of strong trends on college campuses to teach communism or socialism. Well, once the camera went into these countries and people began to see what was going on, the majority, not all, but the majority of people said, oh, okay, that wasn't what we thought it was. But you had then 10, 15, 20 years of college students who were taught very sincerely that if Marxist utopia worked out, it would be a great world. And so they claimed that when actually the Soviet Union was exposed for what it was, the solution to that was they just didn't do it right. In fact, that's why Orwell wrote 1984 as a cautionary tale to the British communists or the British socialists, because he saw what was happening in the Soviet Union and thought they had missed the point about communism. So he writes this book to have this kind of balancing effect so that good communists would understand how not to see it distorted. And now, of course, it's one of the most famous books in the world, exposing what many would see as the inherent dangers of communism. But you've got people who were formed all that time to genuinely believe this about communism. So now they're going through their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and they're reaching positions of influence and authority, so it's trickling down, but getting watered down because now the next generation is coming up and getting a different system of thought. Does that make sense? So you've got this trickle down into pop culture that works its way out as the people who embrace it age, frankly. And then the youth who are being trained with something new, that's going to trickle down into culture. That's what's happening with postmodernism. Those who were trained in postmodernism are now in their 40s, 50s, 30s, I'm not sure what the heyday was, let's just say 40s and 50s. The entertainment business, they're the movers and shakers. So a lot of what you're seeing coming out of Hollywood is postmodern. It'll change. In 20 or 30 years, I think it'll be different because you've got a new set of people being trained with a new way to view things. It'll trickle down eventually. I don't know that people try to purposely sweep it under the rug. I think it's more of a just like, that sounded really good, apparently it was wrong, I'll try something else.
How could it sound good? It sounds so nonsense to me. I mean, I can't imagine anybody swallowing this. It sounds like people have, to me it sounds so nonsensical,
It's the kind of idea that's fun to debate in a classroom or to intellectually grapple with. What if words don't mean anything? I mean, really, words are symbols. I've had some really genuinely thought-provoking discussions about how language works. And I walk away from that going, that was really interesting. And then I go home and I can communicate with my 6-year-old and go, okay, it was a great idea. It's a fun theory to wrestle with, but somehow what happens in the real world transcends the theory. And I think if people aren't careful, they get in a bubble of theory, and they surround themselves with people who also like the bubble of theory, and then it self-perpetuates. And that can happen in a lot of different things in life.
It becomes socially acceptable in order to be part of the group. This
Yeah.
is the way you need to think, and this is cool, and this is acceptable, and that kind of thinking is old-fashioned and
Right.
silly.
My mom and dad thought like that.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another reason it perpetuates, Mike. Let's take a movie like Yes Man, which Jim Carrey did. And in that movie, and in fact, if you would read up on Jim Carrey, he's embraced in real life a theory that's very close to that. I read an interview that he did, and it was baffling, to say the least. But the premise of the movie was that you need to embrace every experience that life offers you. Say yes to everything. Stop saying no. He was living a life of fear. He kept saying no to all these experiences. He goes to a seminar and a guy says, say yes to everything that's offered you. You'll learn how to live. So there's some moments in the movie where he says yes to things that are genuinely good things he should have said yes to before. There's other very disturbing moments in the movie where he says yes to things he should never have said yes to. But the movie makes no distinction. It simply says, if you can be the kind of person who embraces every experience, says yes to it, and does it without regret, you will learn how to live. Now, that's nihilism. That's what Nietzsche said. One of Nietzsche's goals was to become the kind of person who could do anything with no regret. And that's what he promoted as the goal for everybody. So here you get a movie like Yes Man with Jim Carrey, who's a popular actor, who's actually taking Nietzschean nihilism, which to some degree has formed postmodernism. And you're presenting it with one of the most famous comedic actors, maybe in the world, but in America. The movie was very entertaining. It's a classic scene where he drinks Red Bull because somebody challenged him to it. I forget what it was. And I mean, there's great laughs, and this real subtle and dangerous message gets embedded in a movie that's very compelling to watch. So if you're a person who's experientially driven, you're walking away from that going, what I just saw was a fantastic representation of what life would look like if I say yes to everything. Now that's not a cognitive decision, that's an emotional decision, that's an experiential decision, but a very formative one, I think, for many people. So I think entertainment perpetuates this, perhaps more than sitting in a college class does.
I can easily see it being the idiot way to live, but I can't see it being the intellectual way to live. I mean, it just seems like such a disconnect, and it kind of surprises me that it's been highbrow, that it's been elevated to something superior to logic.
See,
You know.
but Mike, that's a great point, because one of postmodernism's pushbacks to modernism was that modernism was all intellect, facts, logic, science, reason. And postmodernism said that's insufficient. In fact, it's so insufficient that we need to elevate experience. And so really pushed that to the side and said, you guys, that doesn't count. You can't bring it to the table. Experience is all we're left with. So you have, in modernism and postmodernism, polar opposite ways of viewing life. What I think is compelling about the Christian worldview, among other things, is that Christianity melds these two things. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That involves your intellect, it involves your emotion, it involves your experiences. It brings everything together and says you can't separate them to truly understand life as God wants you to understand it. You've got to make them all coalesce. I think that's part of the compelling message that Christianity has to bring to a culture, to say you don't have to live an oppositional approach to the world like that. Combine them, and that's when you'll see life in its fullness. Okay, I'm going to wrap up questions at this time. We've got more to do. Thanks, everybody.